welcome to the second episode of the Martinus Cosmology Podcast, our new podcast dedicated to talks and reflections on life, seen from the perspective of the Danish writer Martinez and his works. We are sitting here again in the Martinus Centre, Klint in Denmark. My name is Pernilla Rosell and I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. And we are so happy to once again welcome two guests to our podcast, Mary McGovern from Scotland and Colleen Turoczy from England. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you, Pernilla.
Thank you.
We know that both of you have studied the Danish writer Martinez and his cosmology for many years. And in our first episode, you talked about when you first came here to Denmark and how you first encountered Martinez's world picture and what it has meant to you since then.
Yeah.
But we didn't really talk about the contents of this world picture. You mentioned some aspects like reincarnation, planet beings.
Yeah.
The role of Christ and other things, but we didn't have time to go into detail. And we can also say that Martinez wrote about 6,000 pages, so we can't possibly try to cover this in one podcast or even in 10 podcasts, but we thought it would be nice if you could continue your talk and reflect on some of the topics that you found particularly interesting in the beginning. So if you could go back in time, Colleen, do you remember what questions you had at the time when you first encountered Martinez?
Yeah, when I first encountered it, it wasn't even in writing. It was just this strange idea that somehow one day in the future we would evolve into being a planet being, which captured my imagination for some reason. Well, I think the reason was because it was part of the cycles of reincarnation. Mm. And I had grown up, as I said before, as a Catholic and loved a lot of what I learnt. I loved to hear about Jesus, all the stories around Jesus, but I didn't like a lot of the stuff around religion. And for me, it was Martinez's wonderful explanation of reincarnation that I went to speak to Mary about, and when she told me and we looked at the symbols, that it for me was a whole world picture that made sense. It filled in the gaps in my thinking. So I don't know if you can remember what you said to me all those years ago, Mary.
I can't at all. It was so long ago. But of course, it can seem very far out. The idea of becoming a planet can seem very, very far out. But Martinez describes our evolution as an eternal process. It has never begun and it never ends. And that we evolve from one kind of an organism to another organism. And at the moment we are in human organisms, but we're evolving to a higher level of evolution, which he calls the real human kingdom, where we are neither male nor female, even though that might sound a bit strange, but we see that sort of opposite sides in our consciousness are growing. So a female side is growing in men and a male side is growing in women. We see that very much in society today. That could be a whole talk on its own, but we're moving forwards to another kind of organism, another kind of morality, a morality that will be 100% loving and 100% understanding and forgiving and so on. But evolution doesn't cease there. So after many, many epochs of time in higher spiritual worlds, then we will incarnate in organisms like the Earth. Martinez describes the Earth as a living being. So if you see the whole spectrum, you can see that the human being is a living being on the planet Earth, which is also a living being. And it lives in an even bigger organism, which is the Milky Way. And the Milky Way lives in, I missed out the solar system, but it's life within life within life. And if you go the other way, then our organism consists of organs, which consists of cells, which consists of molecules and atoms and so on. But everything on every level is alive. So all these organisms, from the tiniest imaginable little particle, and you can't ever reach the tiniest, but you can maybe not imagine anything tinier than a certain size, to the most enormous organisms. They are organisms for living beings. They have a consciousness. They have a wish to experience life. They have an ability to experience life and an ability to create. So it's one continuum. So even though the idea of us becoming planets might seem a bit far out, it is, for me, part of a very logical structure of the universe, which is basically life within life within life. If it was life within death, if you imagine we were living on a planet that was dead, the planet couldn't support us. It would be, there would be no life on the planet. So we live in the living universe, and we are an organic part of that living universe.
And I think that's what I liked as well about Martinez, that he has the different levels. He talks about the microcosmos, which is in the living world, the beings inside us. In Martinus Cosmology, we talk about the mesocosmos, which wasn't a term I'd ever heard before, but that's this.
Yeah, the mesocosmos is this part of our evolutionary cycle. In other words, fellow human beings, animals, plants and minerals.
So the sort of terrestrial earth that we're living on. And then he also goes up into the macrocosmos. So I like the fact that that it's a complete world picture from the tiniest to the greatest. And even to talk about the tiniest, there's nothing so small that it can't be halved. So there is no tiniest particle. No. I mean, the basic unit that the Earth consists of. I mean, I know the scientists are looking for the smallest particle and so on, but they'll never find it. What it all comes down to is units, what Martinez calls life units of life. It's living beings. It's all living beings. So maybe they're looking for some sort of tiny dead particle, and they might find the particle, but if they find it, it'll be alive. I mean, it will have a consciousness and an ability to create and experience. So, I know that you were saying earlier that for you, because also you were brought up as a Catholic,
yes,
that it was Martinez's descriptions of Christ. That was your big question as a child about the resurrection and the crucifixion, and how could that possibly have helped mankind in any way?
Yes, it didn't make sense to me. I felt it was right, but I didn't understand it, and I wanted to get an understanding, and just by asking the question I was sent out of the class for blasphemy. So when I read Martinez's little book Easter, I was so impressed, because what Martinez shows there is that Christ's behavior was the model for our behavior. If we want to gain total initiation into the solution to the mystery of life, if we want to become all-knowing, all-loving, we just have to do what Christ did. And what did he do? I mean, he managed to forgive his neighbours when he was hanging from a cross with nails through his hands and his feet, and a crown of thorns on his head, and a spear through his side, and blood running down his eyes and so on. He looked out. Martinez has this wonderful description where Christ is hanging on the cross, looking out through the blood that's pouring over his eyes, and looks down at his persecutors, his executioners, and says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And
that what impressed me about Easter, I also found it very moving. It really sounded as if Martinez was there.
Yeah, it did.
And witnessed it. As if he was...
because he describes things that are not in the Bible. Like this, like he's looking from the inside. He's inside Christ's head, looking out through these eyeballs that are covered in blood. It's a very engaging description.
It's very powerful.
Very powerful description.
And did you feel it answered your questions then?
Yeah, because if Christ's behavior was a model, then that made sense. If I could forgive in every situation where someone irritated me slightly, never mind crucified me, and if everyone could do that, the world would be a totally different place. I mean, there would be no wars, there would be no arguments in marriages, there would be peace on earth, really, if everybody could forgive. And of course, it's not enough just to believe in Christ to be able to forgive. And this is where Martinez's explanation comes in, because Martinez shows that Christ's consciousness was at a level that we will all reach, and his cosmic science is to support us on this journey towards reaching that goal, because Christianity and the other humane religions came with dogmas. They gave us dogmas saying thou shalt love thy neighbour, and you have to forgive 70 times, 7 times a day, and so on. But they didn't say why or how, and who is my neighbor anyway, and so on. But Christ is, for one thing, he's expanded the idea of neighbor to include the macrocosmos and the mesocosmos and the microcosmos. We're used to neighbor just being people around us, but it is the whole planet. It is the animals. It is the plants.
And our own bodies.
And our own bodies.
How we care for ourselves and our health.
Yeah, so what we think is very important. If we're angry, we are sending particles of aggression, so to speak, from the stomach area to the lungs and so on. You really cause sort of explosions in the microcosmos when you're angry, bitter, jealous, disappointed, and so on. So he said it was very important to realize that our thinking has a very vital role to play in our health. And another thing that he talked a lot about was food, that as long as we make our bodies a graveyard for lots of animal corpses, we can't really expect to be healthy.
That little book, The Ideal Food, is also available in English and has been for a long time. That was also really important for me, because when I first discovered this, I was I'd been a vegetarian for a year or so, and was a young person who was very interested in fitness and health. So The Ideal Food was really important for me as well.
Yes, I had also become vegetarian before meeting Martinus, but when I read The Ideal Food, I felt I got a lot of support, because I got a lot of criticism from my family for becoming vegetarian. They thought I would die if I didn't eat meat. But actually I wanted to be vegetarian when I was about 9, but my mother wouldn't allow it because she thought it would be very unhealthy. But of course that's an understandable belief that previous generations have been brought up with. But as soon as I left home and found a vegetarian restaurant beside the music conservatory where I was studying, then I thought, now I'll be vegetarian. And then shortly after that, I read Martinus' The Ideal Food, and I felt very, very much supported, because I'd only met opposition for that idea up to that point.
And the other thing that really impressed me, and it's quite hard to convey when we're just chatting like this, is the way Martinez talks in his writes. It's sort of long, logical chains of thought. His style of writing is completely different to anybody else, isn't it? And every book, it's quite hard to describe, but these massively long chains of thought, and so this, and so this, and so this, and then we get to this, and then I think that's so different from anything else.
Yes, and he did say that his works were a kind of like it was hard work for our intellectual abilities. It was a kind of intellectual training to read his works. A kind of spiritual training. So he thought that people could concentrate. And if you read his works, you see the first works have even longer sentences than the rest, believe it or not. And I'm one of the translators of Martinus, and you can see some of the sentences are like 22, 23, 24 lines long, and it's quite a job to keep it all together, especially when you're transferring it to another language. But for him, it was just a logical chain of thought. If this is true, then this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and then this is true, and this is true, and this is the conclusion. So, but that's also the appeal of it to me, that it is logical. There are also logical chains of thought. Yeah.
And although it's very logical and a lot of science behind everything he says, he always ends up with a really beautiful picture of the future, which ends up sounding very poetic.
Yes.
And that must be really hard to translate, to get the poetry and the love.
That's one of the hardest things.
Yeah.
To get when he waxes poetical. Yes. Yeah.
That's a lot of responsibility.
That's more difficult than some of the other parts of his work. So. And
the other important thing, as you found, you said that you weren't allowed to ask questions as a child when you questioned your religion. That's the most important thing about Martinez's work, that he doesn't want anybody to accept what he says, and he wants everybody to keep questioning.
Yes, Yes, he says take what you can use and leave the rest. And he wants us to question what he's written and check it against our own experience. That's one of the things he says. Does this match your experience? And of course there can be lots of things he writes about where you have no experience. And you can say, well, that sounds like an interesting analysis. I have no experience in that area. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But in the areas where you do have experience, you can say, well, that's just exactly how I feel, or that's what I see is going on, and so on. So he certainly wanted inquiring minds to read his books rather than just people who would accept them blindly.
Because that's the old religious state which we're now evolving out of.
Yeah.
Mm. My son, he's 15, he's been here this week. My children all love to come here, as I said before, but he said to me today, did Martinez come from the future? And I was trying to answer that question for him. I don't know if I did. How would you answer that question?
Well, in one sense, because he's come from our future, so to speak, because Martinus tells us that when he was 30 in 1921, he experienced cosmic consciousness, which means he got access to all the laws and principles behind the physical world. He got access to the spiritual laws, and he could directly experience the solution to the mystery of life. And that's a state that he says is not unique to him, but it's something that we will all experience. But for us, it's in the future, because we are not there yet. So in that sense, he represents our future. In another sense, one could say that he's a kind of visitor to the planet, because...
That's the bit he was interested in.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yes, because... well, there is this principle of world redemption where the population of the earth is guided through various steps in evolution. First, we had dark world redeemers like Ahriman and Satan, Lucifer. Those words remain in our language as part of that dark world impulse. And then we had the humane world religions, such as Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and various other humane religions. And Martinus is part of this newest impulse. He calls it the New World Impulse, which is a more sort of scientific approach to cosmic or spiritual questions. And this is what he calls cosmic science. And now I've forgotten what the question was.
Yeah, he was asking him, I think it almost sounded to him as if Martinez was a visitor from another planet.
Yes, because in order to bring this New World impulse to the earth, Martinus described it. He said that a series of small miracles had to take place for him to incarnate here. Because if what he says is right, then he was completely double-poled. He had a complete balance between his male and female sides. But he incarnated in a kind of heavy masculine organism. He was born to parents in Jutland. He was born to another unmarried mother in the north of Jutland, which is a large peninsula in Denmark. And for someone with that kind of consciousness to incarnate in an organism that belonged to a lower level of consciousness, that's what he said took a bit of fixing, but he managed it. So in that sense too, he sort of comes from the future.
Yeah, and the double-poledness is also something that we're talking about 126 years ago now that he was born.
Yes.
But in the last century, all of our attitudes to gender have changed, even in my lifetime. I'm in my 50s now. Yeah, we're much more accepting of different genders, multiple genders, transgender in England.
Yes. Yeah.
That's changed hugely, even in the last 20 years.
It's perhaps one of the things that's, as far as I know, now I haven't read every book on the earth, but as far as I know, it's fairly unique to Martinus that he has described our sexual evolution, that we have these two sexual poles in our consciousness and we are evolving so that the opposite pole in our consciousness is growing. And this explains, for example, the massive amount of unhappy marriages and divorces and the massive amount of lonely people. You can be lonely because you're on your own. You can also be very lonely in a marriage because you don't feel you're on the same wavelengths. You get infertility. There are a lot of people who are unhappy about not having children, and there are other people who are cursing the fact that they ever had them. And then there are millions and millions of homosexuals, many of whom who are looking for an explanation of why they feel as they do. There are bisexuals, and Martinus explains that all of these states have a natural explanation in this, what he calls this sexual polar transformation. And these are all normal conditions. Of course, there are also some abnormal conditions, like being a sadist or a masochist, or harming other people as part of your sexuality. So there's also an explanation for that. But there is this normal path towards becoming completely balanced, the male and the female sides coming into balance.
And it's a very loving explanation. There's no judgment. There's no feeling of anything's right or anything's wrong. That's what I liked as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It's quite wonderful to listen to you both, to your questions and reflections on all these topics. I was thinking of another question that might be quite central today among people of all ages, and that is the world situation today. Because we live in a time that might seem quite chaotic.
Yes.
Even frightening. Perhaps people might be afraid of terrorism, of wars, and so on. So what kind of comfort do you think that Martinez can give us regarding those issues, those questions? What do you think, Mary?
Well, society is evolving, just as we are evolving individually. And of course, there are a lot of things changing. We see the economic system is breaking up, and there are a lot of wars in various places. But one could see them like the storm before the calm, really. He predicts a kind of new world kingdom where there will be peace on earth, where war will be an impossibility, where money won't exist. But there, of course, there will be many painful processes on the way. But one thing I think is very comforting to me is that you are protected to the extent that you protect others. So if I'm feeling frightened about this, some situation, then I can feel, well, I am protected if I'm protecting others. And, you see in America people carry guns and so on, and they have the idea that they need to protect themselves. And Martinus has another view that you are protected to the degree that you protect.
And then, of course, Martinez explains the meaning of suffering and the meaning of what we call darkness.
Yeah.
You have already mentioned it, but it's such a huge topic that I think we would probably need an extra podcast in order to deal with that properly. Martinez gives us answers to those questions, but as you pointed out, Colleen, Martinez does not want us to believe in him, but he wants us to read and reflect and compare with our own experience.
Yeah.
And if you would encounter young people like your son, Colleen, who might be interested in learning more about Martinez and his works, what book or what literature do you think would be most appropriate to start with? Do you have any recommendations?
Everybody comes from a different place, don't they?
I can tell you that our bestseller is The Ideal Food.
Yeah.
That's the book we have sold most of in English.
That doesn't surprise me. Somebody told me just before I came here that the most Googled term at the moment is vegan food.
Yes.
So there is a huge growing interest in vegetarianism and vegan food.
Yeah.
So, and he does give a wonderful explanation of why it's the right thing, not just for your body, but for the whole planet.
Yeah, and for the animals.
Yeah.
So I think if you just look at the sales statistics for the English books, at least, you can see that The Ideal Food has caught people's imaginations. And personally, I have a lot of friends who've read The Ideal Food and maybe haven't read other books by Martinez, but that book was enough to make them stop eating meat and become vegetarians. So, but it depends where you're coming from. For some people, The Ideal Food is the last book they could read because they have resistance to leaving meat and fish behind. But they can be very interested in the world picture. So it really depends what type you are. And here Martinez is very, very pedagogical because he has this massive work, Liebes Buch, The Book of Life, 7 volumes, 3,000 pages. That's one way, one approach, yes. And some people like to go in the main door, volume 1, and then go all the way through to volume 7. We haven't got them all in English yet, but we're working on it. And then there are the symbol books, the Eternal World Picture, and we have the first 4 in English. There are 2 posthumous volumes that have come out recently in Danish that we haven't translated yet. Some people like those because they're full of symbols. They're very visual. They have rather concentrated, short explanations. So you very quickly get an overview of the world picture without the in-depth explanations. Shorter sentences, that's nice. And then we have the so-called small books, and we have about 13, I think, in English. There's a series.
Me, I think the little book on reincarnation was one of the first I read.
Yeah, The Principle of Reincarnation is called. Yes.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
And I like the book on prayer.
Yeah, that's our second bestseller.
The Mystery of Prayer.
The Mystery of Prayer,
yeah.
And again, that's because Martinus offers a scientific analysis of what he calls the 9 thought concentrations in prayer, like 9 phrases.
Based on the Lord's Prayer.
Based on the Lord's Prayer, yeah. As in, not because one should use that, but it's an example of a totally unselfish prayer. And that's his guarantee that prayer will work. It has to be unselfish. But then Martinus has written hundreds of articles. And we have the magazine Cosmos in English. Since we've been publishing it since the 70s. So there is a whole backlog of articles translated into English. And we have more than 100 on the Martinez Institute's homepage, martinus.dk, so people can go in and read articles. So if you want to read something short, you have an article. If you want to read something a bit bigger, there are small books, and then there are the symbol books that are bigger still, and then there's Livsbok if you want the whole story.
And they too are available on the Martinez Institute's website, aren't they?
Yes, all Martinez books in English are on the homepage, except Logic. There's a problem with the translation of a few chapters, so we have chosen not to put that up yet. We will redo the translation at some point.
But you can buy the book Logic as it is.
You can buy the book Logic as it is, but there are some chapters that need some repair because they can really be misunderstood. But otherwise, everything else is on the homepage, and we translate new articles all the time and publish them in the English edition of Cosmos, which comes out 4 times a year.
Yeah, and that's really nice for me at home in England. I still want 4 times a year I get my copy of Cosmos. So it helps me feel that I'm keeping in touch with Klint.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. The articles in the magazine Cosmos can give us inspiration during the year and until the summer courses start again. That's quite nice.
Yeah.
And to me, I don't know if you agree, but I feel that even if you're already familiar with Martinez's works and even if you have read it, you can always reread it because we get older and we experience new things, and then you can reread, for example, that little book, The Mystery of Prayer.
Yeah.
And I feel that we always read the text in a new way and discover something new, perhaps in those passages.
Yeah.
At least that's the way I feel.
Yes. We're always changing, and we have more experiences to relate the analyses to. So, and our understanding of them deepens gradually. So.
Yes, and once again, for those who are interested, we can recommend the Martinez Institute's website. We have already mentioned it, martinez.dk, where you will find lots of articles and books for free, in English as well.
And the Martinus Institute has a Facebook page in English. There's also one in Danish, but the one in English is called Martinus Institute. If you look for that, you can find it. And I put up lots of Martinus articles on it, and any news about new books that have been published or courses at the Martinus Centre in Klint in Denmark, and generally keep people informed about what's going on.
So, that sounds great. And Colleen, will you come back to Klint next year?
I hope so, yes. And my eldest daughter is very sad that she's not here this week, so hopefully she'll be back as well next year. And maybe my other daughter will be back. So yeah, they've all, my whole family have been very influenced by Martinez.
That's wonderful. I really enjoy listening to you, and I think we could go on for a long time talking about those topics, like our development, the world's situation, and many other things, because Martinez has written extensively about it, and you have your own reflections as well.
Yeah.
But for now, I'm afraid it's time to finish this podcast. So, Mary and Colleen, I want to thank you very much, and I hope that you would like to come back again and share your thoughts with us on anything related to your life and to Martinez's cosmology. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank
you.
very much.